Hey guys, welcome back to another Design Clips. This is Dawn, and today we are going to be taking a look at our Holiday Boughs stamp set. This is a new one from our October 2015 release, and it happens to be one of my favorites. And we're going to be pairing it with the Gansai Tambi Watercolors. Now, instead of stamping and then adding our water, we're going to be painting directly to the stamp. This is a really fun and easy technique, so let's get right to it. And we'll start with the supplies. So like I mentioned, we'll be using the Holiday Boughs stamp set. And I'll be working on Tim Holtz Distress Watercolor cardstock, and I'll be using numbers 38, 54, 62, and 91 from the Gansai Tambi Watercolor set. But before I start my watercoloring, I want to stamp and heat emboss my sentiment. Now, I'm using the Misty tool for this, and I love using the Misty when I'm stamping on watercolor paper because it's got a texture. Depending on the type of watercolor paper you're using, it could have really heavy texture. And sometimes stamping on that, it will skip spots. Now, the great thing about the Misty tool is that since I've already got it lined up and it stays in place, I can restamp it several times to make sure that I get a nice clean impression. So here I'm inking it up with Versamark ink, and I'm going to stamp it down. Now here's a little secret. If your Versamark pad is a little dirty, that's actually a good thing because then I can really see if it has stamped well or not. So I can see here that I've still got some spots that are skipped. So I'm going to ink it up again, and then I'm going to stamp it in the exact same spot. And because it's being held in place by those magnets, I know that it's not going anywhere. And then when I lift the door this time, you'll be able to see I have a much better impression, and it's gotten into a lot more of those little grooves. And now I can just sprinkle on my gold embossing powder. Now I did treat this with a embossing buddy bag, which is an anti-static tool, but sometimes because this is watercolor paper, it has all of this texture on it. Some of that powder will stick into some of the little grooves, and that's easy enough to take care of. Just take a small dry paintbrush and just kind of knock those away, and they'll come right off. And then I'll just heat set it with my heat gun to melt that powder, and then as it melts, you'll see it turn from the dull gold to the really shiny gold. And now we're all ready to start our watercoloring. We are going to be using quite a bit of water because I want to do a soft wash all around the outer edge of this card. So for that reason, I am taping it down, and I'm leaving about 1/8 of an inch border. And I'm using the 3M blue painter's tape for delicate surfaces. I find that this is the best painter's tape for the more inexpensive watercolor cardstock. I haven't had any issues with this ripping that paper. Now you will notice at the bottom edge there, my paint is going to creep underneath, and the reason that is because I heat embossed this, so it did warp. Now if I had given myself a bigger border, so brought that tape in further to say 1/4 of an inch, it would have held it down securely, but since I'm only grabbing the very edge of that cardstock, the warping is lifting a little bit, and I am going to get some paint creeping under there, but I'm not a perfectionist, so it doesn't bother me. Now I'm going to wet all around the outer edge with just clear water. And then I'm going to come in and start dropping in a little bit of each of these colors, everything but the gold. So I'm dropping in a little bit of that olive green, then I'm going to drop in a little bit of the blue, and I'm even going to drop in some of that purple. Now I'm keeping this wash really light because I don't want it to compete with the stamping that I'm going to do on top. I just want this to look like there is more of the pine in the background that's kind of out of focus, so it's going to make it appear fuller and give the illusion of depth. And I'll continue this all the way around until I've got the level of color that I want. If I need to, I can add a little more water if it starts to dry on me. This paper does not stay wet very long, so you may need to re-wet some areas. And if you need to, you can even come in and add a second layer. Just let the first layer completely dry, then you can re-wet the paper and then continue to add more color. And then once I was done, I just took a dry paper towel, and I'm just going to run it along the very edges, and this is going to take up any extra water because I don't want that water to run back into the color or back onto the paper because that'll cause those blooms. Then I'll just let this air dry, or you can use a heat tool to speed up your drying time. So to do the stamping, I'm going to paint directly onto the stamp itself. Now you don't want to have your water or your paint too runny, but you don't want to have it too thick either. It's got to be thin enough that you can paint it onto the stamp set, but not so thin that when you make your impression, it's just a big blob. So you want to experiment with the ratio of water to pigment, and you can test that out on a scratch piece of paper before you actually commit to your project. Here you can see I've tested it out a couple of times, and then that way I know exactly how much water to add to my pigment. Once I've got the look that I like and I know about where I want it, then I can go ahead and start stamping on my regular project. Now you are going to get some variation sometimes between more water and less water. It's just natural, but it'll add to the interest. But for the most part, if you practice off on a scratch piece of paper, you'll get a good idea of how thick that paint should be when you paint it on. Here you can see that I'm adding 2 and sometimes 3 colors to the image. I'm not being super careful either. There's no scientific method for this. There's no magic ratio. Again, it's all by feel. So sometimes I will stamp directly again without re-inking it. Sometimes I'll stamp 3 times without re-inking. Again, it's all very organic and it's all by feel. But you can see how by painting directly onto the stamp, you get a nice loose feeling and very minimal effort. So it's just a really fun technique. I've tried it a couple of different ways, and I did post a few more designs on our blog at stampawaywithme.blogspot.com, where I used the same set with a couple of different layouts. So I'll just continue to do this until I've filled in all of the areas around the outer edges. And then you can either clean your stamp by taking it to the sink and rinsing it off. All of the paint comes off pretty easily. Or if you're lazy like me, then you can just take your brush, load it up with some clean water, and just rub it on the stamp and then use your paper towel to blot off the water. I'm horrible about cleaning my stamps. I know a lot of you want to know if things stain your stamps. A lot of the stuff that I end up doing ends up staining my stamps. It's just the nature of photopolymer. Photopolymer really grabs your ink, which is what gives you such a great impression, whereas acrylic is meant to repel water. So that's why your dye-based inks will bead up on it. Whereas photopolymer actually grabs and holds onto that ink. So that's why you get a lot of staining with your photopolymer stamps. If it bothers you, you could always take it and use some mild soap and water in your sink. But like I said, for me, just taking a wet, clean paintbrush and getting off that excess paint works just fine. And now I wanted to tie in that gold sentiment by adding a little bit more gold somewhere else. So if you've watched any of my videos or you follow my blog, you know that means splatters. So I'm just loading up this brush with a very thick concentration of this gold. I noticed that the thicker the better when it comes to the gold. So little water, a lot of pigment. And then I'm just tapping it on the back of my finger here to add a little bit of splatters to the background. And then once that was all dry, it's time to remove our tape. So I'm just pulling it back. When I remove the tape from my projects, I do pull them back almost at a 90-degree angle. So instead of pulling it straight up, pull it back and away from the project. And go a little bit slower. That way, if it does start to rip, you can stop and be a little more careful. You don't rip it off like a Band-Aid. Go a little slow, make sure that it's not ripping. There you can see that it is taking off a little layer of the cardstock, and that's because that's where the water crept up under the tape and obviously weakened the paper, and that's why it pulled that up a little bit. And again, that was because we had a little warping on our paper when we put it down. It is no big deal to me, but if that bothers you, you can always trim this panel down, trim off all of the white around the edge. I decided to keep it at this size and then just adhere it to a standard 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch card base and call it done. And there you have another easy way to incorporate watercolor into your stamping. I hope you enjoyed today's technique, and if you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you don't want to miss any future videos. Now, if you missed our last video, be sure to click on the upper left hand and you can see how we do a little bit of masking with our dyes to create a fun all over background. And then if you want to see an easy way to do some watercoloring using an acetate sheet and your spray mist, click on the video in the upper right. Don't forget, you can find the featured Wpus9 supplies at our website at wpus9.com. You can also connect with us on our blog at stampawaywithme.blogspot.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, and now Periscope. Again, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.